Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. As you guys can see here, I have some pretty old worn struts. These were the ones that were on my MR2 right behind me. I decided to ditch these in place of BC BR type coilovers, which are BC's entry-level coilovers for the MR2, which cost about $1,000, and I'm going to give you my thoughts to see if they're worth it or not. First thing we're going to talk about is the install. Overall, it's pretty easy for your average DIY person. You can get this knocked out in an afternoon. If you're a little bit slower, like to take your time, easily you can get this done in the day. There are 3 things though that I ran into in terms of the fitment, but 2 of them aren't too big of a deal. First thing I want to talk about is you got to be careful with your offset. So just as an example, for my front rim, I have a 17/8 with a 35 offset. Because of how high my offset was, it actually touched the coilover, so I ended up putting on extended wheel studs and a spacer to bring it out so it doesn't hit anymore. These coilovers do come with camber plates on the front, and I made sure to max out the camber so I can maximize the distance there, but it still hits anyways, and it's actually a really common thing for the second generation MR2s, so it's just something to be wary of. The second thing I want to touch on is that if you're running BC BR type coilovers, you're going to have to run 2 sets of rear end links for these. I do want to mention the fact that these actually come with a set of rear end links, so if you have stock sway bars, it's not a big deal. But if you have upgraded sway bars, the end links are going to be a weak point, so it would be a good idea to consider upgrading to heavy duty end links. And that's when it's going to be important to remember that, hey, you need to run 2 sets of rear end links. When you think about it, those first 2 things really aren't even big issues. They're just something to be aware of and you want to plan for. But this third thing actually took me by surprise. When I was installing the rear coilovers, the studs that are in the top hats didn't line up properly with the bolts in the strut tower, or the holes in the strut tower more like it. What I ended up doing was I actually only made one of the holes bigger by maybe about 1/2 mil or so, and then they fit in with no issues. But it is a little disappointing because I understand they're entry-level coilovers, but on the other hand, it was still $1,000, so it would be nice if they fit in with no modification. I do want to mention the company that I bought these from, which was Prime Driven. They actually reached out to me and made sure that everything went okay, and I told them my experience. What surprised me more than anything was just how honest they were, and I don't want to misquote anything, so I'm going to read what they said verbatim. Their first email was essentially, hey, I wanted to check in. Did you get your coilovers? I responded with, I got the coilovers. They went in fine with only one fitment issue, and that was the rear strut top hats didn't line up correctly. I let them know about the fact that I, enlarged the hole that's furthest away from the midline of the chassis by about 1/2 mil, maybe 1 mil. They then responded that, I'm glad you were able to remedy the strut top situation. I've run into that issue a couple of times, but typically not needed. So again, I really appreciate the simple fact that they were so honest about it, but there's also the other fact that this is a bit of an issue, so that's just something to be aware of. Let's talk about handling now. Probably the biggest thing that I noticed was how it helped minimize bump steer. So with the previous setup, I had Tane lowering springs, and the shocks really weren't well matched with it, along with the fact that the suspension geometry was out of whack, and the fact that I'm running wider tires than stock. The bump steer was horrible. With these coilovers, what I've been able to do is raise the car back up, get the suspension geometry back in line, and it's helped so much. The bump steer is not completely gone, but it's significantly reduced. Also, the oversteer. With the previous setup, the car was super tail happy. Is it still tail happy? Well, absolutely, but it's a lot more manageable. I feel like that kind of comes down to 2 things. The first one is the way I set the car up. So what I ended up doing was I raised the car a little bit. So if you're a stance guy, I'm sorry, because this is probably going to offend you seeing that wheel gap. The same thing is true for the front. There's a bit of a wheel gap. But what that's allowed me to do is I've actually been able to set the car to a softer setting, which allows the suspension to go through the travel. But more importantly, the back is a little bit or considerably softer than the front. So that when I'm on the throttle, it really squats hard and grips. I feel like the other thing that helps me is just the simple fact that I went with like the stock BC coilover spring rates, which is 5K in the front and then 8K in the back. And the reason I did that is super simple. I do a lot of autocross events and the pavements tend to suck. While a super stiff suspension setup is going to be great on a racetrack, if I'm on the roads and specifically that autocross events I'm at, it's not going to be very helpful, because if the suspension is too stiff, the tires aren't going to be able to keep contact with the ground. I know not everyone does autocross or events like that. So there's going to be the question of, can you live with these every day? And the short answer is absolutely. I know this may come as a shock to most people, but I personally feel that the BC coilovers are more comfortable than Tane lowering springs. So with the lowering springs, I had a lot of issues with the suspension bottoming out and rubbing on stuff. It was not comfortable, so if I hit something like a bump, it really was jarring. In comparison, the BC coilovers do really good. I don't have issues with them bottoming out. As I mentioned earlier, there's not as much bump steer. They also soak up the bumps really, really well. So when I do my long road trips, just as one example, I did 200 miles in this car round trip, and I felt pretty good overall. I mean, I will admit I was tired, but I think that's just more of an issue of the fact that it's a partially stripped out car, has solid bushings and everything like that, so it's not going to be as comfortable compared to, say, a stock MR2. I feel it's very important to mention that from my experience, yes, you can daily drive them. Yes, they feel great. They're soft and they're something you can live with every day. But it also comes down to how do you set them up, because this has, I think, like 30 levels of adjustability. To some of my thoughts, I actually do think the BC coilovers are a great value. I don't think it'd be necessarily fair to compare them to something like the KWs or the Koni Alex Wilhelm based coilovers. Those things cost 2 to 3 times more than these. So don't expect as much, but for the money, they're a fantastic deal, even with the minor fitment issues. If you guys have any other questions, because I'm sure there's probably things I didn't even think of, make sure to ask them in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.